I don't know where my glasses are. Oh, that's sweet. You look.
Good on you, baby.
Yeah.
Hello, Deborah. Your AI note taker. You want hi, Laura. Sorry, that's money. I have to put it this way. There you go. Do you want to record this thing for your AI note taker, Deborah? Hello, Deborah. Apply this permission to all future requests. I don't know what that is. Two people entering the waiting room. Hello, Deborah. Is Deborah there? Right. Who's Deborah? Deborah's AI note taker. Admit. Ay. It's this thing. No,
Oh,
I don't like that. You understand?
I think you could maybe decline it. Did they respond to you?
No, they didn't.
Maybe it's the thing that they're automatically putting on now.
Yeah.
It could be.
So I could
I think
remove?
with Otter AI, I would remove
Otter?
because the person no one has messaged you.
No, I talked there in the waiting room chat, and they're not answering.
I would hit decline then, because maybe
Okay.
it's like a Zoom is trying to automatically
Okay. Remove.
add people or something.
Okay, don't report. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
So now I can start go and speak
Yeah, it's
and
recording.
uh
Can they see?
can they see? No, they're out of the room now.
Oh, I
So
mean,
they have
no,
to come with
can the Zoom people see?
But we'll ask her to do that. One, two, 1, 2. Is that okay? Sound is okay? Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for your patience. We waited a few minutes so that the people who are in person could brave the snow of downtown. Welcome all those of you in the room and those of you on the Zoom link. I'm Dominique Marshall. I am the chair of the Shannon Endowment Committee. I'll do a small introduction, and then the convener of the series will do the introduction proper before we hear from our speaker. This is the last of 4 lectures, and thank you to all of those, and I've monitored them and that I've been faithfully following all of them. And the theme for next year is not decided yet, but we will email those people who registered to tell you about it when we know about it. And I have a series of 5 thanks. First to the donor, Lois Long, who passed away a few years ago, who gave enough money to run that series every year and also to finance the travel of graduate students 1 year after the next in the Department of History. And her colleague, who is a retired member of the department, Bruce Elliott, who made that series possible and narrowed it down to themes in Canadian and social history. This is more than 25 years later, and we're very grateful. The second lot of people is the committee, which includes Alexa, our convener, who is assistant curator at the Museum of Science and Technology, chairman of management, James Miller, the administrator of the department, Darlene Muss, and the convener of last year, Laura Dogoro, who is with us today, whose experience we add to the long experience of the series. The third batch of people are the communications people at Ingenium, where Alexa works, and at Carleton, those at our faculty, and those in the department, the communications committee, and all the people they hire. Finally, not finally, last but not least, the Faculty of Science and the Institute of African Studies have co-sponsored that event and made also a financial and publicity contribution. And I wanted to make a special note to thank all the graduate students who have come to all of these places, and some of them have participated in a seminar linked to that series led by Mary Ose-Owisu, who is adjunct professor in our department, who is with us in person today. At the end of this, we will have a draw for a full year pass for Ingenium, that's the Museum of Science and Technology and the sister museum, Aviation and Agriculture. And I will enter the names of the ones who are online, and those of you who have arrived later could enter it at the entrance. This meeting is recorded for the part where Dorothy will speak. After that, we switch off the recording so you can say whatever you want in the Q&A. So without waiting further, here is Alex.
You can say whatever you want in person within reason, we'll say, for the Q&A. But hello, everyone. As Dominique said, can you hear me? We're good? Okay. I'm Alexa O'Hara. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the assistant curator, domestic environments and social diversity at Ingenium. I have light brown skin, short curly hair, and today I'm wearing a black sweater.
No, they're
Start, I did want to
That's not
acknowledge
impressive.
that our talk tonight is happening on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people who have lived on this land since time immemorial. And I ask us all to reflect to the many ways in which settler colonialism, slavery, and its afterlives are interconnected and persist in our present day lives. And I want to thank you all for attending our last lecture in this edition of the Shannon Lecture Series. I want to give a big thank you to all of our speakers and our audience members, to Emily Gann from Ingenium, who entrusted me with planning and selecting the speakers, to Carleton's history department, specifically Dominic Marshall, who really shepherded me through this entire, sometimes overwhelming process. And as someone who is a graduate student of Carleton just 2 years ago, it feels a little bit surreal to be in this position of running this whole show this year. And all of our speakers have really taken to heart this theme of Black histories and futures of science and technology. They have brought forth new methodologies to material culture-based histories. They've challenged sort of simple last narratives of technologies, highlighted the generative work of Afrofuturism, and have traversed sports history and its linkages to anti-Black racism. They've really touched on what I see as this inextricable link between Black histories and futures of science and technology, and it's been incredible to learn from them. And I'm sure our last talk tonight will be no different. It's an honor to introduce you all to Dr. Dorothy Williams. Dr. Williams is a historian, an author, an educator, researcher, content developer, and consultant who specializes in Black Canadian history. Dr. Williams has authored 3 books, including Montreal, 1628 to 1986, and Urban Demography, The Road to Now, A History of Blacks in Montreal, which remains the only chronological study of Blacks on the island of Montreal. Her most recent book from 1998 is a translation of Blacks in Montreal into French, and I heard potentially there is a 3rd translation coming soon. Her thesis, Sankofa, Recovering Montreal's Heterogeneous Black Print Serials, focused specifically on the range of Black print culture in Montreal, and most recently, she was one of the recipients of the 2024 Order of Montreal. And with that great introduction, I'll hand everything over to Dr. Williams for a very exciting talk.
Good evening. My presentation tonight could fit under media studies, print culture, cultural productions, ethnographic book history, and even sociology. The study of newspapers as serialized cultural productions has been developed over the decades through the work of the Bibliographic Society of Canada and the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publication, better known as SHARP. I'm giving a nod to these organizations as they were the catalyst decades ago for me to delve into serialized literature within Canada's Black communities. A little bit more about my background before I get to the subject of the freelance newspaper in Montreal. I grew up in Little Burgundy, that is Montreal's historical Black community. This is a map of the Southwest neighborhood on the island. It was the home of the subject we're exploring this evening, that is the freelance newspaper, signified by the red X at the top of the border of the community. And my home is to the south, just a few blocks over. It's that purple star in the middle. As you connect the dots, I come into this presentation with both personal experience as well as scholarly interest. Moreover, between book histories and print culture, I worked in community archives, that is, at repositories that did not have state-sanctioned funding and were usually supported by the umbrella organization from which it emanated. To be clear, these were volunteer positions. Nonetheless, my archival work fed into both these passions and interests. Along the way, I have had a twofold mission. One, to understand and uncover Canada's unknown Black history, and 2, to change Canada's narrative. Over the years, as I journeyed towards my doctoral dissertation, I also worked in local nonprofits. So I come to you this evening as an independent scholar, retired but enthusiastic. As a starter, I'm going to introduce race papers, a subject you may not be familiar with. The freelance emerged within the North American tradition of a race paper. Race papers had one goal in mind: to guide, counsel, educate, help Black people in trouble, and through columns suggest solutions to problems and means of correcting injustices. The term race paper is used by African-American journalism historians to describe 19th century rise of Black print media. Since then, race papers have also been called Black papers, the Negro press, and have even been included with the term ethnic media, a term often preferred in Canada. Race papers, or papers specifically for Black readers, had sprung up in the antebellum period, those years between the Revolutionary War and the start of the Civil War. The first was New York's anti-slavery paper called Freedom's Journal, which was founded in 1827. And during this time, Canada also had several race papers, most notably the Voice of the Fugitive and the Provincial Freeman. Both newspapers operated in the ex-slave communities of southwestern Ontario in the 1850s. Other Black newspapers were published out of London and Hamilton right into the 20th century. These newspapers sporadically served the various Black communities in Ontario. Despite its large Indigenous Black population, Nova Scotia did not get its race paper, the Clarion, until after the Second World War. So here's a bit of context to understand some of the challenges of the community in which the freelance arose and collapsed. Blacks in Quebec fared slightly better than Nova Scotia with the launch of the Freelance, its first Black newspaper in the heart of Montreal's Black district. The Freelance was inaugurated in June 1934 at a time of great economic distress. Unemployment was rampant and opportunities were extremely limited due to ethnic segregation in the labor market. The poorest families were forced to remove their children from school to send them to work. This perpetuated a cycle of poverty as illiteracy ensured another generation of working poor. Though there was poverty of the pocket, there was no poverty of the mind. Indeed, the people in this community persevered and continued to aspire to finer things, the social graces, earthly refinements. And in the depths of the Depression, the drama and literary clubs went on nurturing youth through the teaching of music, the cultivating of dramatic arts, and by maintaining a sense of belonging, of challenge, and self-discipline by encouraging contacts, volunteerism, and philanthropy. The names of community organizations posted here is just a smattering of the cultural options that were made available to Black youth and community members. So despite the economic and social deprivations, the Black community was steep in arts and culture. Music and theater were very much part of the life within the community. Education was valued, and the mark of education was the fostering of Black literature, poetry, and debate. And for some, nothing was finer in those days than the new music, jazz. Oops. Prohibition hits Harlem in 1918. So where do you go to jazz? Well, Montreal became a jazz force on the continent, and its ascendancy begins in the 1920s during the interwar years when the Freelance was operating. When jazz fever arrived, Black-run venues operated in Montreal without segregation. These included Rockhead's Paradise and the Café Saint-Michel. Soon, jazz was the economic engine. As US money flowed, Montreal's economy benefited from the receipt of taxes from amusement parks, legal betting, the horse tracks, overflowing hotels, and lively restaurants receipts. It was this era that cultivated and defined Black musical genius in the neighborhood and prompted Sin City as a Montreal moniker. Now I'm going to move beyond the environmental and social context that existed at the time of the establishment of the Freelance. Instead, I will share some context about how I, your presenter, came to be in possession of this newspaper. At this point, and important aside, tonight's presentation, I just want to share this with you, that tonight's presentation is a survey of the last remaining 26 issues of the Freelance. So I must make that clear to you. These dates evidence the period of issuance, and they're stored in Quebec, and to the best of my knowledge, this newspaper is not archived nor in a repository anywhere in North America. While some of you check on your cell phones the veracity of that statement, I will stop for a moment and tell you the story of how I came into possession of this unknown Montreal treasure. The background of the story occurred around 1940, around the demise of the newspaper. One day, dispirited and disappointed, the editor, Edward Packwood, sat brooding in a chair in the front of the roaring fireplace in the living room. Around him were his children. Beside him were stacks of the last issues of the Freelance from various runs. You know, at the end of every run, you may have 20 left or 100, whatever. Over came Mr. Packwood, grabbed handfuls of the paper and tossed them into the fire. Sensing something was amiss, the children ran into the kitchen where their mother, Anne, was. They told her what their father was doing, and they hatched a plan. The girls returned to the living room while Anne called Edward to fetch an item from the uppermost shelf in the kitchen. The girls acted quickly. They grabbed what they could and ran into their bedroom. They hid the issues in a box under their bed. Well, finished with his wife's request, Edward resumed and only stopped when the last Freelance was burned. For over 70 years, those secretive issues remained in that box. Except for a few within the Black community, that story is unknown. In 2000, as a friend of the family, I got to look in that secreted box. I held yellow copies of the Freelance. Oh, I was heartsick as pieces of the paper crumbled when I touched them. Even with white gloves on, the little pieces of cornflake-sized newspaper covered my fingertips. The evidence of this paper, both the oral account and the box contents, are not part of our public story. And like many other pieces of Montreal's Black history, they remain invisible. I recall that I queried these two girls, of course, they're now women at that time, now elderly, highly educated women, why they had not deposited this newspaper before it was entirely lost or discarded. They told me they did not trust the archives and did not believe anyone would consider the Freelance worthy of collecting. Why did they believe this? They had, like me, grown up in libraries and archives, and yet, just like me, they were hard pressed to find evidence of themselves in those spaces. So now I'm going to talk about the owners. From an office at 1809 St. Antoine Street, which I showed you on the map, that red X, 3 Black men, Edward Packwood, a businessman, William Trott, a tailor, and Eric Hercules established the Freelance Publishing Company. Together, they created a newspaper called The Freelance. Though The Freelance began as a 3-way partnership, the paper's lifeblood, creativity, and content comes from just one, Mr. Packwood, the focus of this evening's presentation. Note, this is the masthead. It gives us clues about the Freelance ownership. And a bit more, I'm going to go into the individuals here listed on one of the early issues. Eric Hercules is listed as the editor. However, by December 1934, the paper comes out in June. By December 1934, editor Eric Hercules was no longer with the paper. Not much is known of his origins, his education, occupation, residence, or familial ties. It appears he was active in the first issues. In September 1934, the first issue that I have on hand, Mr. Hercules and Mr. Packwood are on a goodwill tour of Western Ontario to promote the paper. The article talking about that tour included that they had gone to Chatham, Windsor, Detroit, Michigan, and, quote, surrounding vicinity. Further, Hercules was mentioned in the social and gospel pages in that same issue. Moreover, he penned an op-ed titled, As It Occurs to Me. Except for his name on this masthead, There are no other references to Hercules in the subsequent 25 issues. And I looked. I'm not supposed to say it's not written here, but I looked. Yeah. The next owner was well-known businessman William Trott. For several years, he opened a tailor shop and occasionally advertised in the paper. Trott was business editor, a position he was to hold until the paper folded. And finally, we have Edward Packwood. Though he was listed as advertising and manager editor in the masthead, Mr. Packwood played many roles and appeared to be the engine and the personality that defined the character of the paper. Should there be any doubt, Packwood put a notice in his paper. It was usually in the bottom corner of the same page as the masthead. So you had that sort of all of the details of the paper and its publication. And at the bottom in the corner, in this little notice, it would say, "To all concerned, the freelance publishers of the Freelance, Canada's greatest Negro weekly, is owned and operated by E.M. Packwood, who is solely responsible for the editing, publishing, advertising, and circulating." So it was clear. Of the three, even though Mr. Trott's name remains right to the very end listed as business manager, it's very clear from the issues that I think this is in about 10 or 12 of those issues where he's clearly stating he's responsible. Okay, so to give you a look and feel of the paper, I'm going to separate the nameplate from the masthead and then break it down to give you an idea what this 1930s paper looked like. I will be using newspaper talk here with some explanations. The Freelance started as a 20-page monthly broadsheet, an expensive proposition by any measure to maintain. Not surprising, by its first anniversary in June 1935, the Freelance was reduced to 8 pages and shrunk about 2 to 3 inches. So the original copies of the paper go right to the very edge of 8.5 by 14 or whatever the size was. And you see that using the same paper, it's at least a good 4 inches or so reduced. The size and page, that reduced size remains all the way through till the end, or at least until the final issues that I have. The Freelance never wavered from that broad style sheet of 4 columns per page. It still had the fold, except on the first page when exceptional news was presented under a full page banner. Moreover, the Freelance, like other broadsheets, had a midline fold captured in the photocopies. You might see that a little later. The idea was that the Freelance would be seen as a serious paper, rivaling not only the city broadsheets of the Montreal Gazette and the Montreal Star, but also other American race papers that were distributed in the Black community. And here's one example of paper. Okay. The Freelance competed with other race papers in the city, and that's why it was quite distinctive. Yet it wasn't due to its size, rather, or style, but rather its nameplate, that is its front page title. For this first 6 months, the Freelance published under the nameplate, or sometimes we call it the masthead, as Canada's greatest Negro paper. Oh, what did it do? What did I do? Sorry. There we go. I guess that's the way to handle that. The earliest versions of the nameplate simply sported the name. There were no graphics, logo, or photo to accompany the text. What the reader did see were the ears, those 2 boxes that sat on either side of the name. And in the first instance, both were advertisements, as you see, advertisements. Perhaps here you'll notice in the first Christmas edition that the editor, William Trott, was one of the advertisers. Over time, other changes took place in the look and stance of the paper. As the anniversary issue approached, the ears were moved above the name and the logo. Therein, the Freelance proclaimed itself as Canada's greatest Negro weekly in that wreath there. Moreover, it announced its journalistic philosophy and mission boldly in the ears. I'll read it just in case it's not clear. Oh, it is clear here. Okay. The People's Advocate, inspiration for every home, read from coast to coast, dedicated to the cause of social justice, racial understanding, national progress, world peace. However, what gave me a second look, I don't know if it did you, was the Freelance was now sporting a distinctive logo, a beaver in the heart of a maple leaf. This was phenomenal. With a beaver embedded over a maple leaf, could anyone doubt this was a Canadian rag? Clearly, from the beginning, the editors were distinguishing their paper. The 5 issues between May and July 1935 were blazoned in this fashion. So I have the dates here. The brand was yet to undergo a couple of more changes. First, in the fall of 1935, the Freelance was now an Afro-Canadian weekly. The Freelance took the bold step to shed the appellation Negro decades before that became fashionable. Also was significant in this regard is Afro-Canadianism set it apart from the journalistic approach of other race papers in Canada at that time. I've never seen such an impression from a race paper anywhere in Canada. It must have been so helpful for a porter when they smuggled their papers across the border. And so you had this Canadian paper, and it was very clear that Montreal was in the game for the race papers. I mean, you know, you could see it. Excuse me. The final brand element that was added about a month later from what you just saw, and I'm not sure if you can see it. Yeah, you can. It's so clear here. Okay, so underneath Afro-Canadian Weekly is the word independent. Did you see that? Okay. Without access to every issue, it's not clear to me as to why the editors felt it necessary to add that one word. Regardless of the intent, what you're looking at is now the Freelance. It took about 18 months to shape that identity. And of course, none of this is earth-shattering or unusual, as newspapers do often change their look and feel, for those of you that are aware of serialized printing. So now I'm going to talk about the elements of a typical newspaper. And I can say that at least before the advent of the internet, it's very typical. The Freelance is very typical in that regard. For example, news articles, you could find news articles, both national, international, poetry, editorials, opinion pieces, classifieds, local events, sports, comic strips, homemaking tips and recipes, obituaries, and puzzles. I am sure this sounds very familiar to you. Moreover, in keeping with many 19th century papers, the Freelance also devoted some of its pages to serializing books. Summarizing the international content of the Freelance, we have items from the West Indies, South America, and various African countries. Less than half of the content was on American news, and though events affecting African Americans were reported, the Freelance items were not timely. Sometimes the event at press time would have occurred up to 3 weeks earlier. Nor was it unusual to find an item that had been composed from several different items in other race papers. Readers did not often buy race papers for the facts, but rather for the paper's unique spin that had an impact on the welfare of Blacks, including legislative and court battles for civil rights, Jim Crow protests, ongoing investigation on lynchings, stories of murdered Blacks, and other miscarriages of justice. So now I'm going to talk about the journalist. With its mix of Canadian-based reporting, news from the wires, and items from race papers in America, the freelance bevy of contributors was mixed. Readers were often acquainted with items from New York correspondent Juanita DeShield. Why? She was an ex-Montrealer living, she was actually attending school in New York. And she was not the only one that was contributing articles from where she was, but she was the most prominent. These international contributors, as they were called, were noted in the masthead, I believe, in 2 issues. However, attributing exact name to articles and features was difficult. Items filed from Alabama and British Guyana, for instance, made it challenging to determine who were direct contributors and whose bylines from other presses he just grabbed and put in, right? Okay. So contributors in Canada were easier to identify if you knew they were Canadian. So recruiting seemed to be a full-time preoccupation. Almost from its inception, calls went out for contributors in other parts of Canada and even the Caribbean. Within that first year, the freelance had regular bylines featuring journalists from contributors from Ontario, Manitoba, and the Maritimes. Montreal Blacks were treated to items pertinent to Blacks in these regions. This is just a partial listing. I didn't go through every issue and talk about all of the items coming in, but he had full page, sometimes double spreads, pages called Ontario Supplement, and 2 pages just full of Ontario news. That as an example. So these are the contributors that at least I found. I tried to find some of the names. Anyway, I'm not sure if any of them are familiar. Potter's became doctor. He's not a doctor at this point, but he actually gets a doctorate in sociology and does some demographical work on Blacks in Canada. I think you know about that. I'm not sure about anyone. Apparently Eric Hercules was an author. I couldn't find what he wrote. I don't know any of the other names that I could share with you, unfortunately. Okay. So expanding its reach beyond Montreal was an attempt to maintain a vibrant, self-sufficient paper. For that, generating advertising revenue like any paper, it was quite critical. The freelance, like other race papers in North America at the time, was a poor press, often on the brink of economic disaster for lack of advertising. It was not able to operate at full potential, and it appears that different printers were used. The debt load was a constant concern for the editors, particularly Mr. Packwood. And apparently, according to his daughters, he wound up paying off debts for several years after the paper folded. But it was never quite out of debt. He was never debt-free. And income from readers never met expected levels. And as a result, the publishers switched printers often and eventually had to resort to Lacombe's court to meet the paper's mounting debts to be able to at least pay them off in installments. So while advertising just barely helped it survive, so it was clear, despite all of the efforts he put into the advertising, it was not going to work. So let's find out who supported Montreal's only race paper. The freelance advertising base was small, with only 3 national or provincial advertisers: Bell Telephone, City and District Savings Bank, and the Liberal Party. Of these, only Bell Telephone advertised in most issues, and the revenue generated by the Liberal Party quarter-page ads were short-lived, limited to an upcoming federal election. In the 4-year span of papers that we have, of course, he's picking up on the political news as well. Notably absent from its national advertisers were the railway companies. CNR and CPR were located situated locally on the outer boundaries of the district, and the railway industry was the single most important employer of Black men in the district at that time. It has been estimated that 80% of the city's Black men worked on the railways, and none of them supported the paper. The most important advertiser in terms of space and frequency were the liquor producers. Ads from Molson's, Dow's, Dawes, and Seagram's were regularly featured. So let's look at local advertisers. There were only 5 citywide advertisers situated either in Verdun and neighboring Westmount or in downtown Montreal, and just 3 of them advertised in every issue. The most consistent advertisers were the 5 local businesses with addresses in the district. They were either run by Blacks or offered exclusive Black products. These local and citywide ads were generally 1 or 2 columns wide, usually no larger than an eighth or a quarter of the column's height. Other local revenue derived from these regular classified sections that he had. One was the business directory, which usually had 24 to 26 ads. The church directory, which could have anywhere from 8 to 12 ads. And lodges and clubs, which were very small, usually about 3 to 5. Classifieds were charged anywhere between 2 to 5 cents a word or $2 for insertion in 4 or more issues. The church listings illustrate 2 points. So I actually, oh yeah, you can see, sorry. The church listings illustrate 2 points that I'm going to deal with quickly. First, there are 15 ads here, yet only 2 are for churches in Montreal. I don't know if you quickly saw that. The others span the country from Nova Scotia to Alberta. And this gives you a glimpse of the population's regional makeup in Montreal. The city was a railway hub like Winnipeg, but of course it was the headquarters of the railway at that time. But it was the hub, a hub for recruiting, et cetera, training, and for attracting Black labor from everywhere on the continent and across the country. So, and these churches were a reminder to ex-residents that were now in Montreal of what was missed, and also to inform any porter passing their way that once they're off the train, they could attend a Black church in their community. The perennial question for advertisers is how many eyes will see their adverts. The freelance claimed to have a circulation of 10,000. As Montreal's Black population at that time hovered between just 3,000 and 4,000, including children. This high circulation underscores the publisher's intent to become a national paper, to broaden its coverage beyond Montreal's local news. And beyond these boasts, we have no other evidence of the actual circulation, except that we know the paper was read by whites. Excuse me. The freelance, like many other organizations, courted the powers that be. Articles reveal the paper's connections to various ministers, priests, and rabbis. The mayor was included on that list, attending the 1-year anniversary celebration of the paper. Municipal and provincial and federal representatives could be seen at the various galas, dances, and public events. They appeared to also be in attendance during political debates and town halls conducted by the paper. The freelance reach was beyond just the local Black community in that area. And just to clarify that, having shown you the map of Little Burgundy, only a very small section had Black residents. I don't know if you're aware of that. Montreal was a segregated residential space. So the area that I showed you with that cross, and also where I was living with the star, was very, very limited. There was a whole section or 2 in that neighborhood where it'd be hard pressed to find any Black people living. So it went outside the physical borders of the community, but there was also a very implicit understanding of where, quote, the Black community was. Anyway, so in St. Henri, Verdun, Westmount, and other places, the freelance apparently was known. Okay, so although the paper is described as a monthly, yes, it did start out that way, but it did not continue as a monthly. By May 1935, when the paper's frequency had increased to once a week, and so you'll see on the nameplates, it's calling itself a weekly. So every time, I don't know if you noticed that, but every time I was showing you a new rendition of its brand, it was including the word weekly. So in fact, I call it a monthly simply because from the first issues, you're looking at, well, what kind of paper was this? It's a monthly, but it changes its frequency, okay? Until it folded, I'm not sure if until my last issue that I have, it's called a weekly. So when the freelance began in June 1934 as a 20-page monthly, it was 3 cents a copy. 3 cents a copy. Readers outside the Montreal area were charged 5 cents, but they couldn't sustain that split rate. Obviously concerned with operational costs, in the December 1934 issue, it's still a 20-page monthly, but the price rose over 200% to 10 cents, regardless of where it was purchased. So now it was kind of a flat 10 cents. And perhaps the lack of sales, because they probably got some pushback, reminded the editors that the community was in a depression. So the next issue that we have on hand, the prices dropped to 5 cents for everywhere, no matter where it was sold. All right, economic factors in the market, right? Okay. So the freelance covered African and diasporic events in Harlem, in Paris, West Africa, Jamaica, and a host of other places. Influenced in part by the global vision of Garveyism, the local community was regularly exposed to Black events in the world. In the early issues, these two factors influenced the distribution pattern of the paper. So I guess I like red dots, but anyway, red dots just showing you, giving you an idea of the distribution. It's not precise. I mean, it's just to give you an idea. So retaining agents or sellers as, actually he called them agents, but retaining agents, those that were in charge of the distribution and people that were selling the paper from their home or in their business, this was a real challenge for him. In the early copies, we have long lists of addresses of the agents where the freelance could be bought. So he actually lists where they would be distributed. Some were individuals, other were businesses. And in the earliest issues, the call for new agents were repeated on multiple pages. During 1935, the freelance employed a strident tone for new agents, threatening the demise of the paper if no one stepped up. At the same time, it offered robust incentives to willing agents. And by 1937, the paper no longer regularly had a whole section called Where to Buy column and places right internationally and across the country. But in the last maybe 5 or 6 issues, you don't see that column anymore. So this would lead one to believe that the international agents or sellers were no longer willing to or could not acquire the freelance anymore. African-American historians record how race papers engendered lively discussions in the barbershops and hair salons and restaurants that served Blacks. And this cultural phenomenon was perhaps replicated in Montreal's Black community, as well as, is talked about in New York and Chicago and other places, that men would get to, particularly men, I don't know why, maybe women didn't do it, but the men would get together and they would talk about the paper, what was in the paper, or they would be in the barber's chair and they would have these discussions about items and lynchings, etc. So apparently one place in Montreal where this was occurring was in Mr. Packwood's restaurant. It was a distributor for New York, Amsterdam News, for Garvey's Negro World, for the Pittsburgh Courier, and others. Here's a list of distributors or sellers of the freelance within Quebec. So what I did was I split up the lists between those Canadian locations and the international agents of the freelance. So it doesn't correspond with particular papers, but if you look, there are names as well as the locations of where you could pick up. Now, as I said, in the latter issues of the paper, you don't see this list at all, or any kind of sub list. It doesn't exist anymore. Okay. Though designed to be something for everyone, the freelance was basically supported by the city's Black porters and their families. Many porters, particularly those from the Caribbean, were often highly educated men, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and the like, who were forced into portering once they got into Canada. Trott and Packwood were well versed in the tenets of Garveyism and often attended activities at the UNIA, short for Universal Negro Improvement Association. They believed that Blacks had to rule themselves. Mr. Packwood admired Garvey's view about self-reliance. The more radical of the two, between Trott and himself, Packwood believed that, quote, God was a creation of white people to subject Black people to them. And he, end quote, and he saw the church as a political vehicle. For this reason, the freelance did not always get carte blanche support in the community. The paper was boycotted by even the porters in the city when it became rumored that Mr. Packwood himself was going to start his own church. And I'm sure that, I'm not saying that there's a correlation directly to why they weren't buying the paper and his frustration, but this is just one example. Mr. Packwood, recognizing that the society he lived in was divided along colored lines, also appreciated Garvey's approach to race and racial pride. This belief came to the fore in many editorials in the freelance anti-fascist, anti-imperialistic stance. And remember, this is the interwar years. By reading race papers like the freelance, Blacks were made aware of some of the grassroots anti-fascist activism in the diaspora. This included reports on speeches, on organizational activities, voluntarism, and the ongoing political protests that you see in New York, Chicago, and a couple of cities I saw in West Africa as well. Okay. Including this exploration, I want to underscore that the freelance was always Pan-African focused. And indeed, this is what brought the freelance to the attention of the Montreal mainstream press. I'm going to share two of the ongoing coverage of the paper, the freelance, that spilled onto the pages of mainstream media. In July 1936, Fred Christie, a passionate Canadian fan, walked into the Forum's York Tavern with three friends to go to a boxing match. Christie ordered three beers. The tavern staff refused. House rules prohibited serving a Negro. Christie and his friends demanded to be served, but the staff refused. Even after Christie called the police, they would not be served. Unable to stomach such prejudice, Christie sued York Tavern. At first, he won. But York Tavern appealed, arguing a private business could do what it pleased to protect its commercial interests. The Court of King's Bench in Quebec, the provincial appellate level, agreed with York. And even though the final decision in 1939 dropped long after the issues on hand, remember my last issue is 1938, the decision from the Supreme Court comes in 1939. But even though there's, we never actually see in the freelance what the reaction was, I can tell you that up until once this happened, the freelance covered preparations and they led the fundraising in Montreal to pay for the lawyer to move the case to the Supreme Court. The freelance also covered the legal and social impact throughout the case. All right. And they put themselves front and center as being anti-racist, anti-Black racist paper. And they were the ones that were advocating for the social welfare of Blacks. So 4 years later, Canada's Supreme Court ruled that businesses could set their own rules as they please. And given the stamp of approval from the Supreme Court, this decision is even today recognized by jurists as the case that legalized de facto racist business practices in Canada. So, the second coverage. There's one other campaign that the freelance waged that got the eyes of the press, the mainstream press in Montreal. This was the struggle for African domination by the Italians over Ethiopia, aka Abyssinia. The freelance was full-throated in support of Ethiopia's defense against the Italian fascists, intent to subdue Haile Selassie and cement its own national glory in the modern colonialism. Because at that time they had the division of Africa, because this is post-Victoria. Where they're dividing the continent of Africa, the European powers. They wanted the Horn of Africa. This narrative is way too complex and complicated to summarize even in a paragraph here. So all I'm going to say is the conflict led to the dismantling of the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, and was the trigger for the Second World. But I will share how the freelance campaign again took the lead in Montreal. During July 1935, as the Abyssinian question took center stage globally, the newspaper became preoccupied with the blatant push for European colonial dominance in the Horn of Africa. Early coverage in the freelance of the Ethiopian conflict actually began with this little small story at the bottom. It was titled, in the December 1934 issue, it was titled, Abyssinians Kill Italian and Rome Makes Much of the Incident. Articles continued apace. It did not take long for the story to become front page news in the freelance. Oh, and elsewhere too, because it was escalating and people were realizing it was escalating. The city's Blacks were concerned and then became indignant with the Italian buildup and how the lack of international response fed the global climate of indifference that allowed Mussolini's forces to cement their hold in the Horn of Africa. In July 1935, as the conflict came to a head, Edward Packwood used the resources of the freelance. The freelance offices became the recruiting center for recruits to go to Abyssinia. For several days in a fever pitch, dozens of ex-soldiers from the First World War, of course, Black youth, students, and other men lined up before the newspaper doors were even opened. After several days, over 1,000 men in Montreal, apparently enough for a Montreal battalion, had pledged to be recruited. And we know of these efforts, as you can see, this is from the Montreal Star. I'm not going to look because I know you can see it. So these, we know about these efforts and the confirmation of the numbers as both the Montreal Star and the Montreal Gazette journalists joined the line of recruits as they would interview the men standing in line, and saw for themselves the earnest attempt to create a response to fight Italy's aggression. And people kept asking him if they could go, when they were going to get on the boat to go to Ethiopia. Could he go to Ethiopia, et cetera, et cetera. Here's actually an excerpt from one of the reports. I believe this is the Montreal Star on July 24th, 1935. Oh, I wrote it here, but you can read it. Okay. This is an actual excerpt from that article. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. More than 235 Montrealers had by noon today volunteered as willing to fight for the liberty of Ethiopia against Italy. Negroes and whites in equal proportions, singly or in little groups, they have climbed the steep stairs to the unofficial recruiting office at 1809 St. Antoine Street. Recruiting reached a peak yesterday when altogether some 50 men came in, signed up, and asked when they could catch the next boat to Ethiopia. E.M. Packwood, Negro publisher of the Freelance, a paper that represents the unanimous resentment of colored Montreal to Mussolini's extension of the Italian Empire at the cost of Ethiopia, has each time had to explain that things are not ready yet for an expeditionary force to leave Canada. No official standing. Today, he had to repeat it again. So my conclusion, the Freelance was part of a long tradition of race reporting in North America, and it presented an alternative picture, revealing to its readers the struggle by Blacks to achieve equal opportunity and equal rights. Like the early message, visible for all in its ears, the Freelance was the people's advocate, inspiration for every home, read from coast to coast, dedicated to the cause of social justice, racial understanding, national progress, world peace. I couldn't have said it any better. Thank you.
What an incredible presentation, Dr. Williams. I want to discuss like every single slide that we saw, but I know we can't. There's so much to unpack, such incredible historical research. I'm very excited, but I'll open the Q&A up to people in the room, open the Q&A up to anyone on Zoom. But please raise your hand if you have a question.
What was the relationship like among the publishers and editors of the race papers? I imagine that they were probably very busy, but did they connect ever? Between the publishers and editors of the different race papers?
Except there may have been a connection with other Garveyites, but I haven't identified who they would have been. So I couldn't tell you that at all.
You mentioned that the paper had to move between printers. Do you know any of those printers, who they might have been, and like, do you know anything about where that was being printed?
No, I really couldn't. I don't have that kind of detail. This really was a content analysis, so I didn't go beyond that. It's actually the very first time I'm doing a talk on the Freelance at this depth.
Any other questions from Zoom, or we'll do a Zoom question?
Thanks. There is a question here saying, wait a minute. You've covered some of that, but from what they could see on one of the photos, the paper covered a lot of political news. The guests would be grateful to know if there are more political things and political stances you could talk about than the one you did for Ethiopia.
I didn't think I was going to have time. Other things, they covered a lot of the elections, what was going on federally. Other things, there were usually just small, I'd say like an eighth of a column talking about something that was going on in courts in the United States with Blacks. And I did mention that they were being lynched and that there were some things like whites being thrown into jail for wanting to marry a black person or something like that. And they would put that in and talk about questions that were being brought up of the Supreme Court at the time, the American Supreme Court, not the Canadian.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering, did you, in your research, get any information about the editor or the paper being in danger because of its views, because of having Garveyism type themes, or because being maybe pro-black and so on? Did they ever have potential violence or antagonism from the outside society?
That's a great question. Actually, I would say the violence, the threats, and the issues people had with the coverage of the paper came from within the community, the Black community. I'm not sure if it's because it wasn't on the radar beyond the politicos at the Montreal level, but Packwood made enemies by his stance over some critical things that people were offended by him. And I don't know, because again, we have gaps. So you have maybe 4 or 5, 6 issues, and then the gap of maybe 2 months, which would actually be 8 issues. So a lot of things could have happened in those 8 issues. So it's very clear that, I mean, I couldn't actually do a continuous narrative, but it appears that his tone changes from the last issue to the first, based on something that's going on, something that he said or written in the paper that got a backlash. And I think that's why people kind of got turned off over time. Not everybody in the community in Montreal was a Garveyite. So not everybody believed in the idea of racial segregation, and most, I won't say most, but there was a significant portion in the community that were actually striving at that time with the belief that if they became more Negro, or what we would call, if they were upstanding Negroes, they would be accepted by whites. It was part of the whole idea of being a Negro, was to emulate white behaviors and white patterning, and it all fits in with that sort of push towards the finer, elocution and drama and poetry. Let's take on something. Let's kind of shed that mythology and that idea of us having lived in trees and being uneducated and all of that. So it's all wrapped up in that whole, I mean, I'm talking sociologically, but it's all wrapped up in that whole idea about being a good Negro. He was not interested in that at all. Very much thinking like it's time for us to move away from that, because whites don't want you to integrate with them anyway. And so we need to work together, pool our resources, get our own strengths, right? But for some people, that was very radical. They were offended by it. They were, they saw him as, I guess, shaking the tree, for lack of a better term. Yeah. So I think more the enemy within would be more of probably a more realistic statement about the world that he was living in. You want to bring it? Yeah.
I was just wondering if you noticed a change in the editorial writing when the freelance adopted the Afro-Canadian Weekly label. Was there a change in the editorial writing in terms of labeling the community, or is that a separate?
No. No, there wasn't really, I didn't see a change. But I would, it's funny because he makes the point very strongly that it's his words. He's going to live or die by what's in that paper. And you see in the earlier issues, that people are writing him and saying, you know what, you can say certain things, but why don't you try to be nicer to other people? Like, you don't have to quite say it like that. And he was like in your face, I guess, for that time in 1930s. And he also seem to, what's the word, foment or stir the pot for gossip. And so social and personal pages were incredibly, I guess it would be seen as revealing to the person that he's, oh, Mr. C was at the house of Mrs. L. You know, it's like, oh, I wonder what he did when he went to church the next day. Things like that. And you're like, whoa. So people who know who AC could be and Miss whatever. Yeah, he did some things that would have alienated people, but for different reasons. I think it would require somebody that has a little bit more understanding of sort of parsing content, which is not was not my focus really. Well, I don't have time. I got other things to write.
I'll do an online question in between. So from online, people are very impressed by the wealth of information you've discovered and are asking, is there any way one day you will make that available to a wider public? And also right now, is there any way for anyone to go and consult these things?
Consult the paper?
Yeah.
No, you can't consult the paper. The paper doesn't exist anywhere. It's not in the news. It's not in a library or an archive.
And have you got any plan in the long term to actually put it somewhere?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, long term.
Very good.
I'm the one that possesses the paper.
Yeah. So
can't-
don't burn it.
Yeah. Oh, no. Yeah, no, I won't burn it. No, if we're actually in talks about trying to digitize it, keep a record and put it somewhere. So if my house does burn, it will be still available because it's a treasure. And the original copies, I have no idea where they are because the two women have died. And of course, for a lot of people, what's left in their estate is not necessarily treated with the same regard. So I suspect the material is gone. So these are the only copies that we have so far.
My question is about the language, looking at it as a newspaper from Montreal, the English language that the publisher chooses. So I wanted you to talk a little bit, why English? And with that, piggybacking on what someone said about the difference when it's a weekly, I wanted to know the difference when it changes from a Negro weekly to Afro-Canadian weekly.
No, she asked the same question pretty well. It doesn't, I don't see a change in the content, but maybe there would be, somebody could do a little bit more analysis on that and might actually be able to track it. But I don't think so. I think what happened with the freelance is when he started off, it was very much trying to reach a broadest audience as possible. I think over time, it sort of reflected more and more his Garveyism, his beliefs of Black pride and independence, self-reliance, and not expecting approval from whites or Blacks. I mean, it didn't really matter. He had his beliefs and he was willing to live by that. And it wasn't, how shall I say, exclusionary. It wasn't, because he's really talking about bringing people together in a positive way. He's using words like inspiration, et cetera, et cetera. But what was interesting to me is moving from very early 20th century way of talking or describing his paper to something that's, for me, is post-war. And this is before the war. Yes?
You just described his backwards, I don't give a whatness. And I'm reminded of Shad Carey's I don't give a whatness, where she just kind of didn't care what people thought. She said what she wanted to say. But in her case, there was barbs throwing in her own paper. Did he do that? Like, was there a public or undercurrent of like argument between his paper and another? I'm talking about competition.
I didn't see that. Similar to another question that was asked, but no, I did see him make reference where he did argue, and that's why I said it was in the community, is he was very upset with the Negro Community Center. He was, excuse me, he was very upset with leaders in the Black community that were not, like when they had the town halls, and they would bring in the aldermen and the people from, that were running to be elected. They were never confronted about the issues that the Blacks had. And he was upset by that. He was upset that people were not challenging the barriers for equity that existed in Montreal, and just seemed to go from election to election, complaining in between, but not really taking the opportunity to challenge them and to make them, make pledges or whatever they needed to do to make a difference. And the Negro Community Center, which was being built up through the Union-United Church, he did not like that attitude either, because they were getting their core funding not from within the community, but from the Financial Federation, which is what it was called, like the Red Feather. Today we have Centraide, or we have organizations that raise money, but they also direct organizations. So they put them in this little box. He was very upset by that, because he didn't feel that a community center controlled by philanthropy outside the community was going to be beneficial for the Black youth. So he never hesitated to attack the NCC. Again, putting him at odds with a significant amount of people in the community. So, yeah, and I didn't see reference to any other paper. Yeah.
Okay, online, another question. I think you said some of that before, but maybe it would be nice to elaborate. At the time, did they have any competitors? And when they shut down, did anyone take on that work later?
No. Did he have any competitors? No, he was the only Black paper in Canada, the city at that time.
What, in Canada?
And when the paper folded, because again, we don't know when it folded. You didn't ask. Okay, so when the paper did actually fold, it took about 20 years before Montreal got another serialized publication. There was a big gap there. There's nothing in between. And I know that from my work and my own dissertation, looking at serialized publication, including newspapers. But yeah, there's about, takes about 1955, I think. Yeah, till the next paper comes out, we start to see Blacks in print again.
Thank you so much for the presentation and your research and the Q&A. I am wondering, I think I am dwelling on the story of the daughters and rescuing that box or creating that box. Did you have a chance to chat with them about their father, about his work, their impressions? What did you learn?
Some of the details I gave you there about him, I got from them.
Okay.
Right. So they, I guess, I mean, in question of being transparent, these aren't two unknown women. One of them was Mayru Sarsfield, the author of No Crystal Stair. And it's the Packwood family that I'm referring to, of course, his family. She was a Vaughan, he was her stepfather. So now if I'm going to mention their name, I better be precise in case one of the family members is on. Yeah, so it's her story and her sister's story, Lucille. And they shared with me their feelings. What I was more interested in, not even so much about him, as to why they were not interested in the preservation of the paper, because that became my focus of my dissertation. And so I was trying to figure out why these two very highly educated women also made the choice to no, I'm keeping it in the box, to the point, that the paper itself could have been destroyed. But so there were a couple of points that I did bring up, came from my conversations with her, my personal knowledge that they shared with me about him. I'm sorry? Yeah. Oh, what you mean, the papers that I do have? Yes, they did. Yes, they were very excited that I was actually working at that point. I mean, I was a doctoral candidate and I was working on serialized literature out of Montreal. looking at Blacks and orality, moving to print, and how Blacks were expressing themselves through various print publications and what that looked like, and why, even though we had these newspapers, bulletins, newsletters, etc., why nobody knows about them, even within the community. So what's going on? What's happening to our own cultural treasure, what I consider to be a cultural treasure? So that was sort of the basis of my dissertation.
Okay, that's my own question. So your paper there reminded me of a presentation by Pierre Anquetil, who was writing about L'Aigle, the Eagle, which was the Yiddish publication of Montreal during the same years, right? And it's amazing, like your one, how open they are to the world. Like they talk about the League of Nations, and they are also very progressive at that time in the 30s. And the thing that Pierre is studying mainly is how did they see French Canadians? Okay, but I'm not finished here. So I would like to ask you, how do they see the French Canadian population of Montreal? Do we ever talk about this? And that fits the last question I have, last question I have online, which is somebody asking, in your paper, the anti-fascist stance, was it also turned against the rising fascist movements of Quebec and Canada at the time? I know it's a lot of stuff.
The second part, no.
No. Okay.
No, it was more about what was going on to Africa, what was happening to Blacks as they were being attacked, what he would have perceived as being attacked by the white colonial powers, right? And the decisions being made to basically rape Africa and take the resources from Africa without benefit to Blacks. That's really what his thinking was all about. He had moved from Garvey's idea of going back to Africa. It wasn't about that, but it was really about trying to educate the community about fascism and the anti-fascism. That was he was anti-fascist because fascism was rising. The tenor of fascism was rising, and that's what scared him. There wouldn't have been control. No, totally different world.
Thanks. I was just curious if you got or researched any of his background, Packham, because I get the impression, and which is another reason why I find your talk so valuable in modern day. I find being born in Canada, a lot of the Black community here comes from somewhere else, often Caribbean, Africa. But at that time, because there was so much back and forth between United States Blacks and Canadian Blacks, do you have any indication of what his background was? He of Caribbean descent? Was he American? And because I had spent some time in Windsor myself, and I also saw more fluidity between American Black population and Canadian Blacks in that region.
I would think he's Caribbean, but I don't want to say that categorically. I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll do a last call for any questions, but also Dr. Oh.
There's one last one there. At the beginning you spoke, and that's always scary, of the distrust that people have of the archives and why that paper was never, yes, it's why that paper was never there. Is your wish to keep that to yourself at the moment part of that same distrust? Because there's also the idea that if it's publicly available, other people can have a look, check it, counter check it, and all that. It's not something that bothers you at the moment?
Things have really changed in the last 5 years. I would say, believe it or not, since the Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, change has actually come from the institutions. They seem to have, and the Black community has responded. I have never, ever seen it. Archival institutions in Montreal so responsive, so open to accepting collections, to really working with Black about what their collections are about, helping them to understand the archival practice and preservations, and looking for the fund to support maintaining these phones, right? This is a really, really recent phenomenon. I've just been amazed how we've gone through maybe one or two major collections, and I bring my students when I teach, they spend at least one of my classes in the archives. The numbers keep growing, and I think we're now up to like 15 clear collections that are being acquired and maintained. I mean, they're all collected because a lot of the people that are giving their collections, they're deceased. They're of the same era, either having grown up around the Second World War or in the interwar years. They have a lot of material about the Black community, and it's very rich material. And if it was it would be lost if, in fact, they didn't keep it, because often the family, there's nobody in the family to leave it to, right? And if you don't collect it, which has happened many, many times, it winds up in the garbage, and the community loses its history, loses part of its library. So it's just a very recent phenomenon, and I'd have to say that it's really an expectation or a response of the dominant society, as opposed to Blacks, who've always wanted would I think have been comfortable to have engaged in that, but it just, the mindset wasn't there and the willingness wasn't there. And it's also like now, you know, Black is a new orange, right? Like what is really important or what is fashionable? And so for a period of time, I mean, that may have sunsetted already, I don't know. For a period of time, it was the thing. So I don't know if that will continue. I expect so, as Black studies in academia starts to gain some traction. They're going to need resources. They're going to need bibliographic materials. They're going to need archives to sustain you know, this intellectual inquiry, which tonight is just, you know, one little step in that, right? You need to have archives. You need a diversity of material. And it's that in and of itself will make it hopefully part of a normal praxis of collecting and sustaining very rich material on Canada's history, which of course, otherwise we're not going to know. We still don't know, but it'll become more and more obscure, you know, or obfuscated over time if we don't make an active effort. So it would be great. But it's still, some institutions are still slow to the game, but you know, I think over time, the realization as the questions come from young scholars themselves walking into institutions and asking, do you have this? Or why is it we've not seen ourselves here, et cetera. It's a very legitimate question. You don't have to ask anymore, what are they talking about? It's going to be, how do we address this, you know? Yes.
When you were doing your research, was there a question about why the name The Freelance?
Oh, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. His company was actually named The Freelance, and then they named the paper The Freelance, but I don't know where they got the name from. That's an interesting question.
Potential research project.
Oh, no, it's great. It's great that we can get, you know, there are just so many questions still left to be answered in Black history in Canada. We don't have to keep researching the same thing because there's so many threads, so many unknowns. I am quite comfortable, even when I'm teaching, to tell my students, I don't know that. Hey, that would be a great thing for you to study when you do your master's, because we don't know. There's just not enough researchers asking those questions. These kinds of questions that come up in discussion, in readings, and understanding, because we don't have all the holes filled.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. I have so many things to say, but like such an amazing presentation that you've given us today. And thank you all so much for attending. I'll take this time. If you've had any inspiration from any of our talks, I'll let you know that applications are open for Ingenium's the second year of Ingenium's Black and African Canadian Scientific and Technological Innovations Fellowship. More information is available on Ingenium's website, or you can come chat to me afterwards. But like we said here, like I think there's 1,000 things we can talk about just for what the freelance, and we're really welcome that sort of research. And then Dominique just handed me the winner of the raffle for today, and that's Helen Kennedy. So very excited, Helen. You can talk with Dominique more about it afterwards. And thank you all so much. Feel free to mingle, have a few snacks, drinks, asking you more questions if you didn't get a chance to. Thank you all so much.